So I'm happy to introduce our first session today, Puritan Pedigrees, the Deep Roots of the Great Migration to New England. Our presenter for this topic is Robert Charles Anderson, Director of the Great Migration Study Project. Bob was educated as a biochemist and served in the United States Army in electronics intelligence. In 1972, he discovered his early New England ancestry and thereafter devoted his time and energies to genealogical research. In 1983, he received a master's degree in colonial American history from UMass Amherst and was elected a Fellow of the American Society of Genealogists in 1978. He became a contributing editor of the American Genealogist in 1979, associate editor in 1985, and co-editor from 1993 to 2012. He has been an editorial consultant to the Register since 1989. Through his work and leadership in the Great Migration Study Project, he has aimed to create genealogical and biographical sketches for all immigrants who settled New England between 1620 and 1640. That's approximately 20,000 people, and of course includes those who traveled aboard the Mayflower, as well as many subsequent voyages. His scholarship has led to several published volumes, searchable databases on AmericanAncestors.org, a newsletter, tours, and education programs, such as this. In this first session, Bob will lay the groundwork for understanding the greater context of the Great Migration to New England. He will explore the key reasons for this migration and bring to light genealogical and ideological connections that propelled the resettlement of nearly 20,000 people from 1620 to 1640. You'll find a handout of these slides at the conference webpage, as well as a handout. And as with all of these presentations, again, you will be able to watch a recording of the presentation following the completion of today's seminar. Again, please make sure that you remain muted throughout the presentation. You will be able to ask questions by typing them into the chat panel, and Bob will answer as many as he can at the end of the presentation. All right, so without further ado, I will turn things over to Bob.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the first session of today's conference. That building in the background is none other than Scrooby Manor. Scrooby Manor is where William Brewster lived for many years in the late 16th and early 17th century. And this is where the Scrooby congregation met starting about 1607 for just a year or two, before it had to leave for the continent, first to Amsterdam and Leiden, and then, of course, 10 years later on to Plymouth Colony. So that building right there is the basis in many ways, for the first step in the Great Migration. You can see just above the label next to my picture, some little bronze plaques. I think there's another one hidden behind the label. Those have been posted there over the years by American descendants, by either General Society of Mayflower descendants or perhaps the Brewster Family Association. But there are many, many Americans who visit there, and of course that will become more as we approach the 400th anniversary of the sailing of the Mayflower 2 years hence. In fact, in just a month, I'll be leading a tour group to that very spot. So what I'm going to talk about today is the work I've been doing for the last 3 or 4 years on a book which has the title Puritan Pedigrees, The Deep Roots of the Great Migration to New England. And that book, which I have to tell you, I have just finished writing the draft of. It was expected to be published now in October. The whole theme of that book is wrapped up in the 2 words of the main title, Puritan Pedigrees. And what I'm trying to do in the book is to provide further evidence for 2 theses that are pretty well established by historians, but from a strictly historical point of view and not from a genealogical point of view. So one is that the Great Migration to New England is at least principally religiously motivated. There have been historical arguments about the Great Migration going back a century and more, that like so much of the migration, it was principally economically motivated. But many historians have argued, and I am trying to add more evidence to that argument, that the Great Migration to New England, 1620 to 1640, was principally religiously motivated. And then the second theme is the pedigree part. And of course, as genealogists, we think of the pedigree as a family pedigree chart. But I'm thinking of pedigree in a broader context, that of the descent, not just of family lines, but of ideas and of social structures and so on. So we'll be looking not just at genealogical pedigrees, but at intellectual pedigrees and social pedigrees, and how those tie in with the religious motivation and the building of the movement to the Great Migration to New England. So let's look at the Puritan side, the religious side now. If you were to study this subject very carefully, you would discover that in the vast, vast literature on Puritanism, both in Old England and New England, that there are many, many different definitions of what a Puritan is, and that there are many arguments, and people disagree on just what a Puritan is. Part of the reason for that is that it's a moving target. It changed from time to time. The term Puritan, meaning someone who has a purist interpretation of the Bible, and application of that interpretation of the Bible to religious life. That name Puritan was first applied in the 1560s, that is just a few years into the reign of Queen Elizabeth. But I believe that the behavior described as Puritanism had been going on for some decades in England, and in fact had been going on as long as the English Reformation had been going on. So we're talking back to the 1520s. When King Henry permitted the reformation of the church as part of his campaign to get himself a new wife and a male heir. And so if you go to the current literature right now, you'll find many different definitions of Puritan, but I've crafted one, and it's strictly an operational definition for the current book. And that is, a Puritan is anyone who works for reform of the Church of England beyond that allowed by the monarch of the moment. And so Henry VIII was not an enthusiastic reformer. He really was a Catholic all his life, but he was influenced in his religious actions by the needs of getting a male heir. In fact, in the latter years of his reign, Henry VIII instituted what you might call a small counter-reformation and tried to undo some of the work he'd done. When Henry died, he was succeeded by his son, Edward VI. Edward VI had been brought up by strong Protestant, that is, Puritan teachers. And his aunts and his uncles, who were his guardians, in fact, he was only 9 years old when he took the throne, were also strong Puritans. He was, again, although the name had not been invented yet. So he pushed for further reform, but of course he lived only 6 years as King of England, replaced by his much older sister Mary, the daughter of Henry and his first wife Catherine of Aragon, who was still strongly Catholic. And so she pushed things back the other way. And so it didn't take much to be a Puritan in England, by my definition, under Mary, because she was trying to push way back to the old church tied to Rome. Mary only lasted 5 years, died in 1558, was replaced by her sister Elizabeth, who attempted to steer a middle road for 45 years. She allowed the return of some of the reforms that her father and her brother had implemented, but what she allowed in 1559, the year after she came on her throne, she would not permit to change. She had a very rigid idea of what reform would be. And so throughout her reign, there were eruptions of protest against the limits she placed on reform. And that is where the real Puritan movement came to take place. And then from there on, you go each king and queen thereafter has their own opinion toward religion and affects where the boundaries of accepted Protestantism are, and then the push beyond that into various forms of Puritanism. So let's look at some of those forms of Puritanism. This list of 6 categories is my own list. It is a simplified taxonomy of the different responses to the Reformation, the different groupings of people in England under these various kings and queens. And as I just pointed out, this would go back and forth. So at one, I would start at, I'll start at the third stop there, conformists. That's the middle ground. That's the people who are in agreement with the monarch of the day. And so let's, for purposes of this slide, let's assume the monarch is Elizabeth II. So Elizabeth has accepted Protestantism firmly. She has rejected Catholicism, but she has not accepted the more extreme forms of reform that the Puritans of one stripe or another would like to impose. And she kept to a pretty steady course. So for 45 years, conformists or the Orthodox and so on would be pretty much the same group intellectually and doctrinally. I should say that at this time, to call the church that they adhered to Anglican or Episcopalian would not be correct. The church under Elizabeth had some similarities to what we think of as the Anglican or Episcopal Church now, but there are many differences. And so most historians now just speak of the Church of England, meaning the church that was the established church, the church supported and enforced by the government at the time. So looking to the right, if you will, in modern political terms, you had those people who still adhered to the old religion, to Catholicism. Of course, in 1558, there would still be many people, many adults, who had been born before the English Reformation even got underway. And so everyone who was more than about 30 or 40 years old at the accession of Queen Elizabeth would have been born a Catholic. And so did they move with the times and become Protestant, or did they hold on to their Catholicism? And you can identify two broad categories of Catholics. Those in the second line, crypto-Catholics, are those who, in their heart of hearts, in their closeted chambers, were and behaved as Catholics, but in public professed or at least appeared to be members of the Church of England. They would go to church on the Sabbath, they would take communion, they would say their prayers in public, but they were in their hearts Catholics. But they remained crypto-Catholics because they wished to get along. Perhaps they wanted to protect their political or economic status and so weren't willing to be public about their Catholicism. The top line, recusant Catholics, and recusant frequently it refers to Catholics, but what recusant alone means is refusing to come to church, regardless of your reasons. Most frequently Catholics, but it could be Puritans or others as well. Recusant Catholics were those who refused publicly to adhere to the Church of England, refused to go to church on the Sabbath, perhaps maintained their own private priest. You would find many of them to be the wealthier ones who could afford a priest in their household. These were the people who then would be brought before the church courts and would be punished in one way or another. And it was generally only the most powerful who could profess their Catholicism openly and not face serious penalties. Those who were very wealthy, powerful landholders, the earls and the dukes, although there weren't so many of those. Looking on the other side from the conformists, the last three categories, there's a whole spectrum. I've only laid out two, moderate Puritans and radical Puritans, but there was a whole spectrum of Puritan behavior. And one of the parts of the Puritan study industry is to parse out those particular differences. But the moderate Puritans and the radical Puritans, in a sense, mirror the crypto-Catholics and the recusant Catholics. The moderate Puritans were willing to remain within the Church of England. They did not usually speak out strongly about their differences with the Church of England. You'll notice that word conformable next to the moderate Puritans, and that's a sort of an elastic word. What it means was that they were willing to subscribe to the doctrinal statements that the Church of England required. For the ministers, a thing called the Three Articles, where they agreed to the supremacy of the Queen as the head of the Church of England, where they agreed to use the Book of Common Prayer, and where they agreed to conform to the 39 Articles. The difference between the moderate Puritans and the radical Puritans is that the radical Puritans were not willing to sign the Three Articles, saying that they would adhere to the supremacy of the Queen, to the Book of Common Prayer, and to the 39 Articles. None of them really rejected Elizabeth as the head of the Church of England, and none of them really objected to any of the 39 Articles, because there are ways to say they agreed with them, but not really. The difference between the moderate and the Puritan radicals was their unwillingness to accept the second article of the 3 Articles, which was adherence to the Book of Common Prayer. And the Book of Common Prayer had been produced first under Edward VI, rejected by Mary, and then reestablished by Elizabeth. But as I say, Elizabeth set a marker in 1559 of what reform was and what it wasn't, and she wouldn't budge. So she accepted the Book of Common Prayer as it was about halfway through her brother Edward's reign. The moderate Puritans didn't like some things in there, and the radical Puritans certainly didn't like things in there. And so the moderate Puritans would adhere, would subscribe to the 3 Articles with a mental reservation about just how they would deal with the prayer book. The radical Puritans couldn't accept that dodge, and they would openly refuse to sign the 3 Articles, which could get them in trouble. Could mean that they would lose their living, that is, be deprived of the rectorship or vicarship or curacy that they had, which meant deprive them of their income. And then there were the separatists, the people who just couldn't wait anymore and said, this is it, we're leaving the church, we're going to do the church the way we want to do. Now, there are some people who don't include separatists among Puritans. They say Puritans are just those who remained within the Church of England but wanted to reform it further. That's an acceptable definition, but as I say, my definition is operational for the book. I wanted to include moderate Puritans, radical Puritans, and separatists as exemplars of wanting to move beyond the reforms of Elizabeth. And so my personal definition includes those last 3 categories. So what can happen with these people? And I want to look specifically at the conformists and the moderate Puritans. The moderate Puritans, some historians don't even consider them Puritans in some ways because they look like they conform, because they have subscribed to the 3 acts, they were all strong supporters of the Queen. So if you see a moderate Puritan supporting the Queen, that's part of what moderate Puritans did. What they argued for strongly were things that were not as radical as what the radical Puritans wanted. And one of the things moderate Puritans did was to act strongly in opposition to Catholics. And so if you think of yourself as a Puritan and you're trying to protect yourself from the conformist who wants you to conform completely, you sort of look over the heads of the conformists to the crypto-Catholics and the Catholics, and you say, but I want to get rid of the Catholics. I'm a good Church of England man. I want to get rid of the Catholics. The conformists, on the other hand, wanting to bring the moderate Puritans in, will look over their heads to the left, to the radical Puritans and separatists, and they will say, you moderate Puritans, if we give you the things you want, then you will want more. It's the old slippery slope argument. And they would say that to the moderate Puritans, if we give you what you want, then you're going to become radical Puritans. And if we give them what they want, they're going to become separatists. And that'll be the end of the Church of England. So it was always a relative game. It's okay for the person who's right next to you with the minimal difference. But boy, you're going to turn into that radical way off in the distance on the far end of the spectrum. Okay, and with that broad thing in mind, we'll get into some examples here. So this I just came across in the most recent chapter, or maybe it was chapter 11, that as I was writing this book. You'll see at the bottom a citation to William Whiteway. William Whiteway was a prominent man in Dorchester and Dorsetshire. What was going on in Dorset and Dorsetshire in the 1620s was that the Reverend John White of Dorchester was the strongest promoter of migration to New England between the Mayflower in 1620 and the Winter Fleet in 1630. And John White, who was a good friend of William Whiteway's, had organized several ships sending out to New England, and they were building first the settlement at Cape Ann, which became Gloucester at a later date, and then at Naumkeag, which became Salem. But this is a few years later. William Whiteway's observing matters all over England. And so he has, you can see on February 1634, he has this statement. Sir Richard Saltonstall, Mr. John Humphreys, and others of the chiefest of the New England planters were sent for to the council table and required 1, to take the oath of allegiance, 2, the oath of supremacy, 3, to subscribe to the discipline of the Church of England. Now that you'll see is close to what we talked about in the previous slide about what it meant to be a conformist and to be conformable and to depart from that. You have the oath of supremacy, you have the discipline. So while this is a civic council, I think this is the Privy Council, which has all the king's ministers on it. It's not a church council, which can demand the subscription to the 3 articles, but what they're asking for is very close. So to pick up the quote, the 2 oaths they took, but refused to subscribe under our discipline, saying that they went unto New England primarily to decline that. So that's one of the most direct statements I've seen by leaders, and Richard Saltonstall and John Humphrey, and I wish they'd told us who the others of the chiefest were that were at this meeting. We're saying explicitly to the highest authorities on the civic side, on the secular side in England, they were going into England principally to decline that. That is to say, principally to decline to the discipline of the Church of England. And it surprises me that whereupon, after some consultation, they were dismissed. At an early time, they would have been thrown in the Tower of London and likely would have lost their head. Sir Richard Saltonstall had been in New England briefly for a year, winter of 1630 and 31. He had founded the town of Watertown, Massachusetts, but he came back and never went to New England again, got involved in other colonizing activities. John Humphreys had planned to go to New England in 1630, but did not, but he finally made it. In fact, within a month or two of this appearance before the Privy Council, John Humphreys did sail for New England, where he lived for a few years. But as I say, this is the most explicit statement I have seen on the layman's side of their motivation for going to New England. And part of what I'm doing in my book is trying to find more evidence of this sort for people further down the scale among the laymen. There's plenty of evidence about the ministers and actually about some of these more important people. But I was hoping to document more of the religious motivation of the ordinary lay men and women who went to New England. And that's what we'll see for the rest of the talk here. Okay, so we've talked about the Puritan part of the title to the book, and here we'll talk about the pedigree part. So as I told you earlier, these are not just genealogical pedigrees, they are also social and intellectual pedigrees. Intellectual can mean lines of descent at the university, that one tutor at the university would teach another, and in the process of teaching would convert these young men to the Reformed movement, to Puritanism. So I'm trying to pick up all these strands of transmission, oral transmission, close transition, not just of genes, but of ideas and social connections and so on. So we've got a pedigree here that will help us understand the sort of thing that's going on, and we can look here at both genealogical and ideological pedigrees. So at the top of this pedigree is a guy named Thomas Stoughton. And I wouldn't be surprised if a number of people listening today have descents from Thomas Stoughton. Several of his children came to New England. He must have many, many descendants alive today. Wherever you see a name in italics on the chart, that's someone who came to New England. So Thomas Stoughton, you can see, was born just a year or so before Queen Elizabeth came to the throne. So he grew up totally in Elizabethan times. In fact, his life spanned the entire reign of Queen Elizabeth and most of the reign of King James. Thomas Stoughton was born in Sandwich in Kent, but he went to university and started his career in various places in Essex and Suffolk, and he established himself as an East Anglian for his ministerial career. As he was, not long after he left university in the early 1580s, a movement was started called the Classis movement, C-L-A-S-S-I-S. That's a Greek word that means class, a group. And what this was a semi-Presbyterian meeting where a number of ministers would get together, number of ministers who lived in close proximity would get together once a month, maybe even more often, and share ideas, share their religiosity, encourage one another, attempt to improve one another, and in the process also it was sort of a job clearinghouse. As young ministers came in, the senior ministers would try to find places where they could be placed as lecturers or vicars or whatever. So Thomas Stoughton in the early 1580s, just about the time he married, in fact, became involved in what was known as the Dedham classes. And the Dedham classes, there was one or two or maybe three classes per county. They were ministers only. There'd been an earlier movement in the 1570s of a similar nature that it permitted laymen, which really set the Queen off, and those were suppressed. So this was their attempt to have another socializing context where they could share their similar beliefs and encourage one another. Thomas Stoughton was a founding member of the Dedham classes and was active in it throughout the 1580s. So you can see there that his children were born, the ones that we're following here were born during that, well, in 1588 for Thomas, 1594 for John, 1603 for Israel, and there were several daughters also who married and whose children came to New England as well. But I'm focusing on this group here to show you both the intellectual and the genealogical side. Thomas Stoughton, the classicist movement was suppressed around 1590. Many of those members were silenced, that is, they were removed from the ministries and could not preach, at least publicly and without harassment by the authorities. Thomas Stoughton maintained his various offices as rector here and vicar there until about 1605 or 6. There was a change after King James came in. There was a change in the official bothering of Puritan ministers, and there was a movement in the first decade of the 17th century where Richard Bancroft, newly installed as Archbishop of Canterbury, had a rigorous movement of enforcing conformity. And again, enforcing conformity meant enforcing the ministers to sign the 3 articles. Well, in every diocese, and a diocese was roughly a county, although not always, in every diocese, the church authorities brought in about 20 or 30 ministers who initially refused to sign the 3 articles. They then would work with these people for a year or so. They'd say, come back at the next court and we'll try again. And over a year, they were able to wear down most of the ministers who were refusing and bring them to conformity. Now, whether that was real conformity or the moderate Puritan version of conformable that we saw on the Puritan screen is open to question. At any rate, Thomas Stoughton was one of those who would not be worn down. And in 1605 or 6, he was deprived of his living at Great Coggeshall in Essex. So from 1606 until his death in 1622, Thomas Stoughton was without a living. He managed to survive, although barely, by giving lectures privately. That is, he'd be invited by a town or a church to preach a sermon, and he'd be paid some small amount, probably fed a few meals. And he and there were about 100 others in the country who got by that way, some more prominent than others. But it was a very slim and narrow existence. But these people, they were Puritans because they had the spirit and because they were willing to endure many hardships. When Thomas Stoughton was silenced in 1606, he was replaced as vicar or rector, I'm not sure which, at Coggeshall in Essex by Ralph Cudworth, whose name you see in the second line here. He was no genealogical connection to Thomas Stoughton, but it happens that he was the man who was brought in to take his place in the pulpit at Coggeshall. He was known to be a Puritan. He'd been active in his university in the 1590s, had known to be involved in Puritan activities there. He had married Mary Michelle from a very powerful and strong family. He only lasted a few years at Coggeshall, and then he resigned. We don't quite know why. But he ended up all the way across England at Aller, A-L-L-E-R, in the county of Somerset, all the way across in the west country of England. He went there about 1610, and he was minister there at Aller till 1624 when he died. And conveniently, John Stoughton, one of Thomas's sons, who was also a university man and would have known Cudworth in his few years at Coggeshall, decided this was a good idea. He could get a living and he could get a wife all at once. So he went to Aller, married Ralph Cudworth's widow, and became minister at Aller in Somerset. The two sons, Thomas and Israel, neither one went to university, but they were certainly well educated, as we'll see. Moving on, Ralph Cudworth had two sons, a James Cudworth and a Ralph Cudworth. James Cudworth came to New England. Ralph Cudworth was a very important philosopher, moved on beyond Puritanism to a more secular philosophy known as Cambridge Platonists, and was himself both a minister and a master at one of the colleges in Cambridge. So I want to point out, first of all, that I believe it's the case that every male on this chart, except perhaps for Matthew Craddock in the middle, is a published or was a published author. Certainly Thomas Stoughton was, his three sons, Thomas, John, and Israel were, both Ralph Cudworths were, James Cudworth was. And believe it or not, Ralph Cudworth's daughter, Damaris Cudworth, and she's on there, she's well beyond our Great Migration period, but she resided in the parish of High Laver, Essex, the same parish where Roger Williams had been family chaplain to the Masham family. Damaris married Francis Masham, Lord of the Manor there, Oates Manor in High Laver. And she became a correspondent to the famous philosopher John Locke, to the point that in his later life, he moved to High Laver to be with her and to commune with her. She was a published author, as I say, very unusual for a woman at that time, and in quite abstruse philosophical matters. But she and John Locke were soulmates, if you will, and shared their philosophical thoughts in the latter part of the 17th century. So here we go from the genealogical now to the intellectual. So you remember Ralph Cudworth and John Stoughton from the previous slide. They were Ralph Cudworth was Thomas Stoughton's successor at Coggeshall. He moved to Aller. John Stoughton was Ralph Cudworth's successor at Aller. But they were connected by this chart of intellectual instruction as well, because they all went to Emmanuel College at Cambridge University, which was the Puritan institution. Ralph Cudworth became fellow, which means that he was the tutor. He tutored William Sancroft a few years later. William Sancroft had nothing to do with New England, but he tutored John Stoughton just a few years later. So that that led the historian Patrick Collinson to speak very wryly the sentiment on the next slide. In a footnote, he tucked away observed that Stoughton succeeded Cudworth as rector of Aller, Somerset, and married his widow, the widow of his tutor's tutor. I know that's a little complicated, but if you track the previous two slides, you'll see how it works out. But these are the kinds of connections that I'm trying to work out in the book. Now, what you've seen so far is that chart right there gave us nothing but ministers, but John Stoughton's two brothers, Thomas and Israel, went to New England and were prominent in secular roles as deputies to their colony legislatures and so on, and they both got involved in disputes with the authorities and have both left behind written, not published, but written descriptions of their religious and political disputes. And then Ralph Cudworth's son James brother of the younger Ralph Cudworth, settled in Scituate and became involved in these Quaker controversies there in the 1650s, and in fact lost his public civil jobs, his offices, because he tolerated the Quakers, which the colony authorities did not want to. And he wrote a long letter back to England explaining why he did that, which was in close concord with his brother's ideas as a Cambridge Platonist. One of the features of Cambridge Platonism was that it was highly tolerant of other religions. And so James Cudworth brought a little bit of his brother's Cambridge Platonism to Plymouth Colony. But I want to go beyond this then and talk about some very ordinary laymen. And these don't look like ordinary laymen at all in this chart, and I'm going to have to speed up here, I can see. This is a broad chart. Richard Pole and Margaret of York were confirmed Catholics. They were the last of the House of York after the Wars of the Roses. In the next generation, Henry, Reginald, Geoffrey, they were all very powerful Catholics, and they were also very powerful opponents to Henry VIII. And you can see there that Henry Pole died in 1538. He lost his head in the Tower of England. His mother, 3 years later, Margaret of York, lost her head for continuing to oppose Henry VIII. He saw them as the greatest dynastic threats that he had. The middle brother there, Reginald Pole, escaped to the continent, was a very powerful Catholic. In fact, was raised to be a cardinal of the Catholic Church while he was on the continent. He returned to England when Mary was on the throne, became Archbishop of Canterbury for 2 or 3 years at the end of her reign. In fact, Reginald Pole and Queen Mary died on the same day in 1558. You move to the next line, and you begin to see lines in this pedigree that are converting to Protestantism and even Puritanism. And you'll see down at the bottom left, 2 daughters of Thomas Clinton, 3rd Earl of Lincoln, married important people, Isaac Johnson and John Humphrey, the same John Humphrey we saw several slides ago in 1634, affirming his opposition to the Church of England. But I want to concentrate on the matter at the far right. Geoffrey Pole's daughter Anne married Thomas Hildersham, and they had a son, Arthur Hildersham, who is important to our story. So let's move on to Arthur. So here's the Hildersham family. Most of the histories say that Arthur Hildersham, who you'll see on the second line there, was sent away to school in Saffron Walden in Essex to one Mr. Desborough, who was a confirmed Puritan, and that this Puritan school teacher converted Arthur Hildersham from Catholic to Protestant and then Puritan. And it's my argument that actually the change happened a generation earlier under Thomas Hildersham and his wife Anne Pole. And there are many reasons for that. One is that Anne Pole, being the youngest daughter of Sir Geoffrey, who and his wife were strong Catholics, would have been brought up as a Catholic. But what hasn't been noticed is that Anne Pole was the only of the 10 children of Geoffrey Pole and Constance Pakenham to be omitted from the will of Constance Pakenham, which I take to be an indication that she and her family had already converted to Puritanism. So in that next generation, we've talked about Arthur Hildersham. He was minister at Ashby de la Zouch in Leicestershire, very strong Puritan. In fact, in time would come to recommend ministers to go with the Winthrop fleet, and before, he was the reason that Francis Higginson was promoted or recruited to go in 1629 to New England and was minister at Salem just for a year before he died. His elder brother Richard on the left there was a steward to the Barrington family at Hatfield, Broad Oak, Essex. They were another Puritan family, another branch of this family. If you have time later to check back to the previous chart, you'll see them on their wells. You'll see the cousinhood there. Arthur Hildersham married into another Puritan family, the Barfoots, and his wife Anne Barfoot, her brother Edward, married Arthur's sister Winifred Hildersham. When Edward Barfoot died relatively young, she then married Ezekiel Culverwell, who came from a monstrous Puritan family of very powerful merchants in London and very powerful ministers who were headed some of the schools at Cambridge. What isn't shown on here is that when in the next generation, when Thomas Barfoot died, John Winthrop calls him my cousin Barfoot. And in Thomas Barfoot's will, he names as his supervisor John Winthrop, who's not in this chart, Richard Hildesheim, who is in the chart, and Thomas's brother-in-law, John White, who married Catherine Barfoot. Now, that John White is a different John White than I spoke about from Dorchester. This was Century John White, a London lawyer who was very important to the Massachusetts Bay Company in probably drafting the Massachusetts Bay Charter and doing other things to protect the Massachusetts Bay Company. So in the next slide, we'll see the Desborough contribution to, well, okay, first of all, this I've covered in a sense. So this is a quote from Samuel Clarke's biography of Arthur Hildesheim. In his childhood, he was brought up in the Papist manner, taught to say his prayers in Latin, both his parents and their kindred, especially his mother being zealous Papists. When he was to be sent abroad to school, his father's aim was only to send him to a good school where many gentlemen's sons were taught. But God so ordered it by his good providence that his father, unawares, next slide. His father, unawares, placed him at Saffron Walden School in Essex with one Master Desborough, a godly man and a religious Protestant, who, taking great affection to him for his wit and disposition, was very careful of him, and taught him not only that humane learning that was fitting for his years, but the grounds of the Protestant religion. So that's the old story, that Master Desborough converted the Catholic Arthur Hildesheim to Protestantism. I've given one reason why I think they weren't. Another reason is that the Desborough family and the Hildesheim family in earlier generations had been residing in the same areas in Cambridgeshire. I think the families had known one another for generations, and I think Arthur Hildesheim's father knew perfectly well that Master Desborough was a Puritan and knew perfectly well what he was doing in sending him to Saffron Walden, not unawares. So let's look briefly at the chart for the for Desborough. You see on the left there, John Desborough. He was the schoolmaster that allegedly converted Arthur Hildesheim, but he certainly was Arthur Hildesheim's schoolmaster. And you see on here also Walter Desborough and Nicholas Desborough, who came to New England eventually. So especially keep Walter Desborough in mind, because you're going to see him on a spectacular chart here a few minutes down the line. All right, let's move on. This is a slightly different story about the Grindals and the Wilsons. On the left there, you can see Edmund Grindal. Edmund Grindal had been what was called one of the Marian exiles. He's one of those who, during the reign of Queen Mary, was unwilling to conform to the new church, the more Catholic church that she was going to run, and felt so strongly that he left for the continent, lived in Germany until she died, came back to England, and was made first Bishop of London. Then he was sent for a few years in the 1570s, late 1570s, off to be Archbishop of York in northern England. And then finally, when Archbishop Matthew Parker died around 1580, maybe a few years earlier, late 1570s, Edmund Grindal was brought back down south and became Archbishop of Canterbury, that is, the head of the entire church. His sister, Elizabeth Grindal, married a man named John Woodhall. They lived in good old Saffron Walden, where we've just met the Desboroughs and the Hildesheims. I don't know much about them, but their daughter Isabel Woodhall married a man named William Wilson. And that marriage took place in 1578 or 79. That is just a couple of years after Edmund Grindal was made Archbishop of Canterbury. William Wilson, I think a few years before that marriage, had been named chaplain to Edmund Grindal. And chaplain for a top churchman like that meant essentially secretary. Handled his correspondence, handled his official documents, and so on. So William Wilson had a double connection to Edmund Grindal. He was his chaplain for the last years of his life, and he was Grindal's niece's husband. If you look in the bottom line, you'll see especially John Wilson. I think many of you will know about John Wilson, who was the first minister at the church in Boston. And the main purpose of this chart is to show how close John Wilson was to Grindal. In other words, William Wilson worked with Edmund Grindal. William Wilson would have heard stories or actually participated in some of the important events in the English Reformation that Edmund Grindal participated in. So although Wilson himself would not have known Grindal, there's only one step in between. John Wilson would have heard many, many stories from his father about Edmund Grindal's activities and about the reform movement during the reign of Queen Elizabeth. And these are the kinds of 1, 2, or 3 step oral transmission pathways that I'm trying to pin down. One last thing on this chart, you'll see that John Wilson's sister Mary Wilson married a man named Thomas Sheaf. Thomas Sheaf, although considerably younger than William Wilson, had been nominated to a parallel post with John Wilson's father, and that is as a canon at St. George's Chapel at Windsor. But that Thomas Sheaf was from Cranbrook in Kent, which is another hotbed of Puritanism in England, in the so-called Weald of Kent, the south-central part of Kent. And that ties this whole network to a monstrous network of Puritan families in Kent. And so it's the accident of Thomas Sheaf, who was a Kentish man himself, after university, probably through university connections, being placed as a canon at St. George's at Windsor, which put him in close contact with William Wilson and led to his marriage to Mary Wilson and brought these two Puritan networks together. Okay, what's next? All right, this is, we're getting close to the end here. So this is changing gears totally. So there's a man named Philemon Whale who came to Sudbury, Massachusetts in 1639 or 40. He was a brother-in-law to Edmund Rice, who had come to Sudbury a few years earlier. Edmund Rice was one of the leaders of Sudbury, Massachusetts. They had married sisters, the Frost sisters. In fact, Philemon Whale, the two sisters had married Edmund Rice and Henry Rice. Henry died and Philemon married Henry's widow. So, but at any rate, Philemon Whale and Edmund Rice were brothers-in-law. Both ended up in Sudbury, Massachusetts. But in the early 1630s, it turns out they had been wool merchants operating in England, and they brought with them one of their count books, which ended up as a Sudbury Town Book of Town Records. I had the pleasure of transcribing the portions that were the wool merchants' notes. And what is interesting is that although Rice and Whale had married the sisters Frost from Stanstead, which you can see there along the Stour River. They were married in Bury St. Edmunds in Suffolk, not much far north of that. But then they moved all the way over west in Hertfordshire to Great Berkhamsted. But from that outpost, they operated in the early 1630s a wool trading operation. They bought wool and bought and sold wool and bought and sold finished woolen goods. In the 100 or so transactions, and about half of them, a place is named where the merchant they dealt with resided, and you'll see that they're clustered. There's a couple in London and a couple scattered around I haven't put on here, but you'll see 2 clusters. You'll see several towns along the Stour River on the Essex-Suffolk border, which is an extremely strong Puritan area. And then you'll see 3 towns down in Kent, and those are again in the Weald of Kent, as I've said. You'll see Cranbrook, which I just mentioned is the home of the Sheafs, but also Tenterden and Marden. That whole south-central part of Kent is also strong Puritan country. So we have 2 strong cloth trading areas, 2 strong Puritan areas serviced by these 2 brothers-in-law who came to Sudbury, Massachusetts, but worked in those 2 areas, and apparently only in those 2 areas. So it's not accidental, this merger of the religious and the economic. So, okay, and is this the big chart? Okay, so this you won't be able to read much on the screen. It's a handout. You can look at a larger version of it. I won't go into much detail, but this was prepared by Bill Fisk. It's in the Register last year. Every person here in boldface came to New England. Many of them, you can see the ones with the little bullets beside them, settled in Roxbury, Massachusetts. You'll see, especially on the upper left, Reverend John Eliot, one of many Eliot brothers. He was their minister in Old England. But if you look in the south center, the lower center, you'll see our old friend Walter Desborough is part of this hookup. And then just below that is Isaac Heath. Isaac Heath was born in Hertfordshire in Great Amwell. His brother William was as well. William's on the chart somewhere. I don't know, very, very far bottom right is William Heath. But they're brothers, believe it or not, despite their separation there. Both born in Great Amwell. William Heath moved to Nasing in Essex, which is where John Eliot hung out, and so it's not surprising that William Heath came to Roxbury, but Isaac Heath did as well. And I've just in the last month discovered a marvelous document. The minister that Isaac Heath and William Heath had at Great Amwell was Charles Chauncey, who later came to Massachusetts and in fact became president of Harvard. But I found that Isaac Heath was hauled into the Court of High Commission, the highest church court in the country, because he worked hand in glove with Charles Chauncey in doing a number of things that the authorities, the conformist authorities, did not agree to. And so that's a case in Isaac Heath of proving a very relatively affluent, but just an ordinary English yeoman, not a minister, not an earl or a duke, but he was willing to push his Puritanism to the point that the church authorities called him in and threatened to punish him. And then he came to New England. He was a church warden to Charles Chauncey, supported his activities, and was punished for that. So that's a quick run through both the motivational ideas and the pedigree ideas that led to the Great Migration, and it will be the subject of the book that I have just completed.
All right. Thank you, Bob. So now let's take your questions. Feel free to type your question in the chat panel to the right of your screen. All right. So Sue asks if you can comment on the early settlement that's pre-1650 of the area, what we now know as Berwick, Maine, and kind of what were some of the motivations. And she references, a few books and exhibit that seem to indicate that it was more economic reasons for that early settlement there. Can you comment on that?
I can comment in generalities. I don't have any special knowledge of Berwick. I would suggest that you perhaps repeat this question in the next hour. Dave Dearborn knows that part of New England better than I do. But I think you're right that it was more economic there. The Piscataqua River settlements, not Hampton and Essex, not Hampton and Exeter, which were really Massachusetts settlements, but the settlements like Strawberry Bank, like Dover, and Kittery and Berwick were more fishing communities that were settled largely by Sir Ferdinando Gorges and some of his associates from the West Country who were not Puritans. They were good Protestants, but they were not Puritans. And so, yes, that area at the mouth of the Piscataqua River and then the fishing settlements further east in what became Maine were generally more for economic reasons than for religious reasons. I don't know that there's a firm number on this. I have always estimated that of the 20,000 New England men, women, and children who came between 1620 and 1640, that no more than about 10% in the end would have been in the non-religious category. But of course, if that's where your ancestry is, that's what you want to know. But that would be mostly at the fishing communities in Piscataqua and beyond, and perhaps also at some place like Marblehead in Massachusetts, and perhaps a few other spots.
All right, and something that we can certainly repeat for David Dearborn in the next session. So Holly asks, how far down in society did these kind of religious divisions extend? Did the upper class expect that people in their households conform to their beliefs? And really, did the lower classes care or really have many options?
I don't have a full answer to that question. What I can say is that all classes partook of Puritanism, and especially the most radical versions. It seemed to be especially attractive among merchant households in the towns. So that's like somebody like we just talked about, Philemon Whale and Edmund Rice. Edmund Rice would have been, in modern terms, middle class, or perhaps shading into upper middle class. They clearly knew were not, just set in one locality their whole life. They knew good chunks of England. They were well traveled. In general, the Puritan believing people who came to New England, there were very few of, I think maybe just one or two examples of the true nobility, very few, and they didn't stay, very few gentry. The last paragraph I wrote in the last chapter of the book that I just finished was about the fact that the wealthier people who were interested in colonization, who were Puritans, would come to New England, but would soon move on. They were people who were wealthy enough to participate in colonization in several places. Someone like Richard Saltonstall had the wealth not only to participate in the Mass Bay colony, but in the colony he tried to establish at the mouth of the Connecticut. John Humphreys also was involved in the so-called Providence Island Company, which tried to settle a tiny little island off the coast of Nicaragua. So it was someone like John Winthrop, who was of the lower gentry, who didn't have the resources to spread himself all over the place, who could commit himself to one colonization effort, that is Mass Bay, and would stick to it and wouldn't leave. Many of the others who would finance a group of families or a group of close relatives who would pay the passage for 10 or 15 people, what I've come to call yeoman companies, were clearly above average in financial wealth. You will see many servants who come with these families on the surviving passenger list. You'll see servants. These servants were generally not the same as the indentured servants that you would find in the Chesapeake and Caribbean colonies. These were frequently people from the same socioeconomic status, maybe cousins, maybe nieces and nephews. It was very common to sort of trade out the children in that age between 7 and 14 to be brought up in another household, to be taught both manners and what education there was in another household. And those people who were listed as servants on the passenger list to New England, generally, when they finished their servitude, were given a substantial tract of land with what might marry into their master's family and were quickly absorbed into the community, indistinguishable socioeconomically from their masters. There were some poorer people who made the migration to New England, but relatively few. They either didn't have the resources or, again, the Puritan inclinations tended to grab on to people in that middle stratum. And one of the reasons that is thought to be is that the people like a Philemon Whaler and Edmund Rice, who had to run a business, had to be literate to a certain extent, and that meshed with the growth of the English Bible. And so being literate enough to run a business would also mean being literate enough to read the Bible. That means literate enough to follow the arguments of the ministers who said that the true church, must be just as it was stated in the Bible, and not with all these accretions that the Catholics had put on it. And so there was a strong connection between literacy, mercantile activities, and Puritanism. So I think that touches on some of your concerns. I don't think it's an answer to your whole question, but it's the best I can do in a few minutes.
All right, just a few more questions here. So let's see, we have Karen who asks if you could comment on the Antominian controversy. Was it in direct opposition to the Puritan doctrine of Massachusetts Bay? She says, my ancestor Edmund Littlefield seems to have been very involved in this and moved from Massachusetts to Exeter, New Jersey, to Wells, Maine as a result. So could you comment on that controversy?
Well, I'll comment in first place that we're cousins. I descend from Edmund Littlefield as well. By his movements, he certainly does appear to be, I don't know that we know anything of any specific action he did that would be considered part of the Antinomian controversy. And just to broaden that out a bit, this was a situation that arose in 1636, 37, and 38 in Mass Bay around Anne Hutchinson and John Wheelwright. There was the Puritans pushed a religion of salvation by faith alone, that good works availed you not in your salvation. That is to say, whether or not you were well behaved and acted as a living saint was irrelevant to your salvation. You were chosen by God from eternity to eternity as being saved, and vice versa. chosen from eternity to eternity for being damned. And if that is the true, then your actions on earth can have no real effect on your salvation. So this was the cognitive dissonance that the Puritans had to carry with them all the time to espouse their Calvinist predestination of who was elect and who was not elect. They had to somehow figure out some reason for people to behave properly. And anyone who pushed for good behavior, for following the law, being the moral law of the Bible, was considered by extremists to be preaching a covenant of works, that is, as opposed to a covenant of faith. Well, Anne Hutchinson was opposed to this. She argued that the ministers in the Boston church, some of them were preaching a covenant of works, and this got her in deep, deep trouble, as well as John Wheelwright. Some people signed a petition in their behalf. That wasn't appreciated, and so in 1637 and 38, a large number of people were disenfranchised and banned. And some went north. John Wheelwright went north, and that would include the pathway that the questioner asked would be the pathway that Edmund Littlefield took as well, with John Wheelwright to Exeter and then on to Wells. Others went with Anne Hutchinson and others south to found Portsmouth and then Newport, Rhode Island. The antinomian controversy has always been a huge part of the historiography of the early years in Boston. Something I would recommend to you. It's not an easy book, but it's a fascinating book that provides the basis for all this. It's by a professor at Stanford University by the name of David Como, C-O-M-O. He wrote a book, 20 years ago now, I think, called Blown by the Spirit, Blown by the Spirit. And it's a study of antinomian activities in London in the 1620s and early 1630s. So just at the time that the Great Migration was getting organized and so on. Some of you may also know a group that doesn't have the notoriety that Anne Hutchinson and John Wheelwright did, but a group called the Plough Company, or the Company of Husbandmen, led by Reverend Stephen Batchelor and by Richard Dummer. And they were also antinomians, and that was an antinomian group that was organized by a group of London merchants who were of that persuasion. It was deep underground. It's actually beyond the separatist post on my taxonomy that ran, remember the taxonomy that ran from the recusant Catholic to separatists. The antinomians are a step beyond the separatists because they're not only changing the church government, but they're changing the doctrine as well here. There's a passing mention in Professor Como's book about one or two of the people who were active in antinomianism in London in the 1620s and who were also associated with Batchelor and Dummer and the Plough Company. I've been in communication with Professor Como. He said that he had collected a lot of material on them and hadn't done anything with it then, but since I talked to him, he tells me he has prepared it for publication. So I'm hoping within a year or so, we'll see a published article, long article about the Company of Husbandmen that will give you some of the same intellectual background that fed into the Wheelwright and Hutchinson controversy as well.
All right. I know that there were a few questions that we didn't get to in this session. If we don't get to your question, feel free to email me and I'll pass them on to the instructors. Many of the instructors have also included their email addresses on their handout. So again, if we don't get to your question today, or as you watch or rewatch the recordings in the coming weeks and months, and you want to again kind of follow up with one of the instructors, you can always reach out to me and I will pass them on to the instructor, or you can email them directly for those who have provided an email address on their handout. All right, so we're going to take a quick break, but in the meantime, to encourage kind of a conference-like atmosphere here, I'd like to tell you about a special offer just for conference participants. So until July 22nd, When you spend $30 or more at our online bookstore, you can save $10. Just enter 17th century in the coupon code field when you check out. And if you are a member of NEHGS and already receive 10% off your orders at the bookstore, this is actually in addition to those savings. So lots of opportunities for some book and gift buying there.